Hey, this is Stives with Beard Logic, and this is episode 4 in the series where we build an adventure game. We're going to start off by doing a bit of jump polish, and then we're going right into animation, so let's get started. Alright, let's start off by removing these checks. I think the only time we want to leave the jump state is when the time is either elapsed or the button is released, so we're just going to force a transition. And we can repeat this step with the wall jump slide because we want the same sort of behavior there. The difference here being that we are still allowing this player to slide down the wall while we're in the jump state. So we may want to actually transition to the move standard still, so we'll keep that. So now I want to make a distinction between whether the key for jump is being held down or whether it was just pressed. So we're going to add another boolean. Let's call it jump requested. So the reason I'm doing this is I want to add a bit of permanence to the jump button press. I want the game to register that the jump was pressed even if the character is still in the air. The idea is to try and make the controls feel a little more responsive. So let's just add another check in the update function to check to see whether the jump was requested. And once the player has actually released the key or been forced to jump, we're going to make sure that we reset it so that the jump is no longer requested. And in order to make this work, we actually need to make sure that we're checking to see if the button was pressed and then setting the value to true. Otherwise, it's just going to reset as soon as you're not pressing the button down. Alright, from here we can update some of the check functions. When we're checking to see if we're jumping now, we really just need to check to see if the jump was requested. And we want to do the same for the wall slide jump as well. I think that's pretty much got it. Let's test her out. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. I think I may want to change it so that there's no upward momentum after you've started a wall jump, but for now I think we're going to leave it as is. I may have forgotten to mention this. I added a no friction material onto this and I created sort of a belt around the character. This is how I'm making the character slide along the walls easily. If you're curious on how to do it, all you have to do is create a new physics material and set all the values to 0 and set the two enumerators to minimum, and then just assign it to a collider that's slightly bigger than the capsule of the character. Okay, well this is the moment many of you I'm sure have been waiting for. Let's get started on animating this. Prior to starting this tutorial series, I'd actually already done all this before and I'm redoing it for the tutorial series. Last time I did the animations I used the Unity Playables interface, so this is going to be a bit of a change. I'm going to use what probably more people are used to, the Unity Animator. So let's start off by creating a folder called animation, and then I'm just going to create a new animation controller here, call it something like AG Player Animator Controller. We'll be using that in just a second, but first we're going to need to get a model so we can animate it. The quickest way to do this is probably to just go to Mixamo and select a model that you want to use. You do have to sign up for an account to use it, but it's a really nice resource. Once you've selected a model, just import it into Unity and drag it onto your character. For now, let's just disable the capsule so we can see our character. We will be working with it in just a second here. You may notice that Unity has already added an animator to the character that you've just dragged on. And even though we don't intend to use root motion, I still like having the animator right up on the root character. So we're going to get rid of the one that Unity added and add a new one to the root model of the character. So depending on the model that you chose, it may be quite a bit different than the collider that you have currently, so you might need to modify it. In this case, it's going to be wise for us to make the capsule collider quite a bit thinner. So let's do that really quick. And that's a much better fit for this character. And I'm just going to adjust that physics belt that I was talking about a little bit earlier, just so that it fits better with this collider. Then let's just clean up this character prefab a bit. I like to separate the components into visual and colliders for the most part, so let's just do that real quick too. Now let's create a prefab for our character by dragging it into our project view. And something that we should also do is assign that animator controller we created earlier to the animator component in the character. Let's hit play now just to see what happens. Okay, that looks good. The reason it's doing that is because we don't actually have any animations assigned to it, so it's just going into a default pose. So let's just select the animation controller we created and go into the Animator tab of Unity. If you don't already have that tab available, it's in Windows Animation Animator. Now let's hop back over to Mixamo and grab a couple animations. Let's start with maybe a walk animation. This one looks like it's going to do the job for us, so let's download it. Unity and Mixamo don't always play along if you don't download it with the skin, so make sure you download it with the skin, and I like to have 60 frames a second as well. Once the download's finished, you can drag it into Unity to import it, and then drag that onto your animation controller. Now there's a few small housekeeping things that need to be taken care of before you get this working. When you select the animation you just dragged in, you'll note that it's named a little weirdly. I like to name it exactly what it is so that it's easier to find. In the Rig tab, make sure you select Humanoid, and in the Materials tab, well, you don't really need to import materials, so we'll just get rid of that too. Now that you've changed the rig to Humanoid, you'll notice that the Animation tab looks a little different now too. And for this animation, we're just going to select everything that has green on it. We definitely want it to loop. Most of these settings don't matter too much because we're not going to be using root animation, and this animation doesn't really have any. We may find with some of these animations that we're going to have to tweak some of these values a little more, simply because we don't want the animation's root motion. Okay, well, now that we've got that all settled, let's hit play and see what happens. So as you can see, we've got the animation for the walk playing. It's the only animation, and so that's the only one that's going to play, but it's working at least. Okay, so let's grab another animation from Mixamo so we can sort of transition between the two. An idle animation seems like it would be useful right about now. This looks like a good one. Let's go for it. Alright, same as before, we're going to import it into Unity and then do the housekeeping task that I mentioned before. Pretty much identical to the walk animation, so I'm just going to speed through this. Now let's drag that state onto our controller and set it as our default. One quick thing I forgot to do was make sure that our animator was not applying root motion. As you may remember from other episodes, we want the control for the character to be really tight. As such, we want the animation to be driven by the controls and not the controls to be driven by the animation. Alright, so let's create another script so we can switch between animations using it. Let's call it Player Animation Controller. This should be a fairly simple script. It's really just going to be using the player controller's current state to determine the animation. Let's start off by adding a reference to the animator to the animation controller. Makes sense that it's going to need it. I'm going to modify this prefab so that we can add the player animation controller to the character. Let's just have it sit right underneath the player controller itself. And we'll drag the animator onto the reference we just created. And back in Unity's Animator tab, we're going to need a parameter so that we can tell the animation system what state it needs to be in. Makes sense, I'm just going to call it animation state. So the state that we currently have set as idle, we're going to turn into a blend tree. It's something Unity uses to blend between animations. And we're going to be using that state as our general move state. It's going to be comparable to the move state that we have in the character controller. So just right click on the idle state and say create new blend tree in state. Now you'll notice in our inspector it looks a little different. If we double click on the blend tree, we can now add several motion fields that will allow us to determine which animations the blend tree is going to be blending between. So in order to get this to work, we need a parameter. Currently Unity has added one for us called blend. I think we're going to add a new one. It's going to be float, and we're going to call it move. We don't really need Unity's added parameter, so let's just delete that. And back in the blend tree, we can now select the parameter to be move. Now when movement 0, it makes sense that we're going to have the idle animation playing, so idle can go in the first slot of the blend tree. So we're just going to drag that in from the idle animation itself. And we'll put walk into the second slot. And I went back to Mixamo to get a run animation, but rather than bore you with the details, it's basically the same as the walk animation setup, so just follow the steps for that. Now ordinarily you'd be able to see what's going on with the animation down in this window, but for whatever reason we've got a capsule showing up instead of just the character. So I think what we're going to do is go to the prefab and remove the capsule, and hopefully that gets rid of the capsule here too. Alright, that seems to have worked. So now if you hit play in the window here and drag the little red bar along the path here, you'll be able to see that Unity is transitioning smoothly between the animations that you have assigned to this blend tree. So now that idle is now our move state, let's rename it to something that we're familiar with, move standard, and we can get rid of that walk state now as well. So we've got pretty much all of these set up done in Unity. All we need to do now is set the parameters in code. If you remember back to our state tree, we have these states already set up. We're just going to assign an integer to each of them. To be honest, we don't need to do this because the enumerator is already set up to do this, but I'm just doing it to make it very explicit. Now let's just switch back over to our player animation controller class. And we're going to add a reference to the player controller class so we can get the values we need from it. Remember, once we get back into Unity, we're going to need to assign this in the character prefab as well. I had a function for setState here, but I think what we're going to do for now, just to make it simple, is do this all in the update function. So now we're going to pull the current state from the player controller and assign it to the animator. The active animation state isn't currently public in the player controller, so we're going to have to add a accessor for that. So let's just hop over to the player controller really quick and add that. And because each enumerator is technically also an integer, all we have to do is select the current state and cast it to an integer. Just for reference, I'm going to go over and copy over the enumerators into this class so that I can tell which state that each is assigned to. And we have another parameter in the animator that we also need to assign, and I think that's called move. So let's do that as well. Remember, when we're in the move standard state, the animation is blended between idle, move, and run with this particular parameter. Rather than pulling from the rigid body in the player class, we may as well just create a reference to the rigid body because we can grab that from here too. The move parameter ranges from 0 to 1, so we actually want to have the maximum movement speed so we can divide the current movement speed by that. So that means we need to make the movement speed in the player controller public as well. And just one small change, we need this to be magnitude, not Z, and let's give it a try. I actually thought I'd probably have to do a little tweaking before the run animation looked good, but that actually looks pretty decent. Right now, really, we're just transitioning between 0 and 1, so the walk animation isn't really being used. But this episode is already running a little long, so we're going to have to wait till next episode before I can get to that. I really appreciate the interest in this series, and if you like what you saw, please like, share, or subscribe, and I'll make more of them. Bye for now.